This is a Nintendo Switch Pro controller. As is immediately evident, it's not too fundamentally different from other modern consoles controllers. Now, if one were to exclude the capture and home buttons, that gives game developers 12 pressable buttons, 16 including the D-pad, and 2 control sticks for their games to utilize. Arguably the most important aspect of any game is the controls. Sure, Breath of the Wild's open world is what makes that game stand out, but without the fluidity and the way the game's dozens of mechanics are controlled, it would be a far less enjoyable experience. And as Super Mario 64, while still a fantastic classic, could hold up so much better if its controls were updated to be more fluent. Controls can oftentimes separate a good game from a great one. A game where I have to constantly ask myself what button I need to press, what button I forgot to press, or what button I pressed when I shouldn't have, will typically pale in comparison to one that makes me forget that there's a controller in my hand because everything feels so natural. The struggle of implementing mechanics while also being able to configure the perfect control setup for said mechanics is one that I feel us players never think much about. I can only imagine how much time Breath of the Wild's developers had to have put into perfecting the way Link is able to perform so many actions in a way that is easy to pick up for newcomers, yet satisfyingly difficult to master for those who wish to push the limits of their skill. Every button on the Switch's controller is utilized in this game, but it manages to not feel overwhelming. Today, however, I'm not here to talk about all of these. In fact, I'm talking about a game that only uses 4 of them, and that game is Celeste. Now, before I get into the bulk of Celeste's controls, let's first look at what the game is all about. Running from your insecurities, running from a twisted hotel owner, fighting a bunch of eyeball monsters, fighting against your insecurities, scaling to the peak of a mountain, swapping between hell and cold hell. Hello Arthritis, the death of a loved one. A free DLC that takes longer to beat than the actual game. Welcome back Arthritis, and a happy ending. For those who don't understand what I'm trying to convey, the game does a lot with the limited number of buttons it uses. It has many different gimmicks and mechanics, numerous hazards and enemies, a multitude of levels to traverse, and hundreds of collectibles and extra challenges packed into said levels. Just looking at the layouts of some of the game's rooms reveals how complex this journey is. Yet how can it be, when working with such a minute amount of buttons to configure its controls to? Well, that all comes down to the value in simplicity. While there may only be 3 buttons and a control stick being utilized here, it's not simply about the numbers. Matt Makes Games, now known as Extremely OK Games, is a prime example of a developer or group of that looks past the surface of what they're working with. With proper utilization of these few buttons, a player can run, dash, jump, spike jump, hyper dash, reverse hyper dash, super dash, reverse super dash, demo dash, ultra dash, wave dash, attack enemies, grab on the walls, wall bounce, neutral jump, corner boost, grab onto and throw certain objects, glide fly, and manipulate many of the game's obstacles. While many of these names of moves I just listed were coined from speedrunners and not the actual developers, nearly all of them were intended to be in the game. They weren't exploits, they were deliberate developer creations intended to expand on a control system that would at first appear rather simple. The entire main game can be beaten by only using these buttons' primary functions, save for the slightly advanced wall bounce, but through playing the game's B and C sides, as well as its free DLC Farewell, the player is deliberately taught many of these advanced techniques. In Core C side, one is taught the Hyper Dash, an advanced move used for covering much greater distances by dashing diagonally downwards towards a piece of collision and jumping just before reaching the ground. In Farewell, through the use of an unnecessarily nostalgic PowerPoint presentation, the game teaches its players how to wave dash, which is essentially a hyper dash, but with the jump delayed slightly in order to allow Madeline to regain her dash and launch even further. These ones aren't taught, but spike jumps and wall bounces are necessary to get one of the game's hardest collectibles. While these moves aren't required to beat any levels outside of the ones they're learned in, they certainly add to the replayability of the game. Discovering that a once difficult room is now easy to traverse thanks to these advanced moves is satisfying. Finding ways to cut off parts of the stage entirely, again thanks to these advanced moves, is addicting. And just in general, improving one's skills in a game such as this one feels so rewarding. So I've mentioned speedrunning maneuvers to an extent, and there are more tricks that I'll cover soon, but first, let's discuss the situation that those who don't care for the extra content this game has to offer and simply climb Celeste Mountain only to call it quits afterwards were in. While a lot of the super satisfying movements do come from either post-game content or watching speedruns and learning of them there, even the one who doesn't go to such lengths still gets to experience just how fluently complex Celeste's controls can be through the vanilla chapters. The prologue introduces Madeline and shows off how she moves as well as her jump, grab, and dash mechanics. Already, before the first true level even starts, the player knows how to control this character. But it's the constant improvement on their part, in the adding of many complex room designs and mechanics on the developers, that keeps adding layers upon layers to this already complete moveset. The first level is a basic test of endurance as the player dies again and again while slowly improving and adjusting to the controls. It also introduces the mechanic of blocks that move when touched, which allows Madeline to gain momentum and be shot in the direction the platform is moving. The old site is for the most part a harder version of the first level, with greater challenges and a chase sequence which forces the player to act quickly. The Celestial Resort Hotel really ramps up the difficulty, and it's where the player is forced to start throwing themselves at rooms in different ways over and over until they finally find what works. Golden Ridge adds some wind and snowball hazards, and the Mirror Temple, despite half of it being skippable, is one of my favorite levels in a controls aspect. Yes, there are these Seekers, which force the player to be on their guard, and Theo, who must be carried and thrown to manipulate the Seekers while simultaneously making actual progress, but my favorite part of this level are these blocks. They certainly may look similar to the ones introduced at the game's start, but they are far different. These ones only activate when Madeline dashes. The player directly controls them and is forced to keep these blocks in mind whether they want to or not. Think you can get through a room mindlessly dashing ahead? Think again. Though indirectly, these blocks add to the complexity of Madeline's controls, as do these bubbles, these feathers introduced in Chapter 6, and these crystals introduced in Chapter 7. They all directly affect how the player goes about their journey, whether they dash here, there, or at all. Aside from the feathers and bubbles, all of the game's gimmicks affect the controls without actually affecting the way the game controls. As the player gets to know these mechanics, they grow increasingly fluent in moving Madeline around. And because the direct controlling of the main character herself is so simple and compact, the player doesn't have to adjust their fingers and doesn't have to spend time remembering what button does what. Playing this game, even just its A-sides, is a constant flow of progression. Though seemingly simple and easy to master, the controls only get more complex the more the player plays. They'll keep improving and begin to notice that they can actually afford to jump a bit later in order to gain more distance, that they can scale walls without actually using stamina, or maybe that they can actually jump off of spikes if they're moving in the direction the spikes are facing. These 3 buttons in this control stick hide dozens of small intricacies that make this game all the more addicting to keep learning about. And that leads me to my last topic. Those last few moves I brought up earlier but simply haven't talked about yet. As I said, Celeste is addicting to learn about, and to some people, namely speedrunners, the knowledge keeps coming. Many tricks that seem like they'd be impossible to discover I now use just for the hell of it, because speedrunners manage to find them. I may not be good at them, but it's still so entrancing to find out more and more of what this minimalistic control scheme can do. Demo dashes, where the player crouches in midair at nearly the exact moment they dash forward, allow Madeline's hitbox to shrink and shoot right through an otherwise impassable wall of dust bunnies in Oshiro's hotel, as well as in many other places. A reverse hyper dash can be used to skip part of Mirror Temple, and corner boosts can be used to obtain what would typically be non-existent momentum. These moves were intended, as Matt Thorson, the main producer of the game, stated, but it was a certain group of players, the speedrunners, and their dedication to digging deeper into this game's fantastic controls that unveiled them to the public. Now, try to list every move I named in this video. You probably can't. You can't even count them on both your hands, yet you can count the buttons used to perform them on only one. That is the value in simplicity. It's phenomenal how far games have come. We've gone from staring at one white pixel slowly moving its way across our CRTs, to being immersed in a complex world where NPCs interact with others as though actual sentient beings, all from within the confines of our flat screens. It's no doubt impressive when a game such as Breath of the Wild can find a coherent use for every single button on this controller, but it's arguably even more astounding when one such as Celeste can cut out as much of it as possible while still feeling as complex as though every button has its own function. Just playing this game is a reward in of itself. Finally beating that room you were stuck on for half an hour feels like you're overcoming a great obstacle, because you are, but you're also learning more about how the game works in the process. The controls are simple enough to get started, complex enough to want to keep learning, and just addicting enough to want to perfect. But something tells me I haven't reached that last part just yet.